Farmers and land managers across our province are recognizing that tree crops can be very viable. That's in addition to increasing our long-term wood supply. Trees act as a control for soil erosion and increase biological diversity. They are also the benefits of improved water quality and wildlife habitat. There are the added benefits of a diversified farm income and the improved property value. Farmers adopt agroforestry practices for two reasons. They want to increase their economic stability and they want to improve the management of natural resources under their care. Many agroforestry practices incorporate fast-growing trees such as willow and poplar. Called short rotation crops, they're harvested for biomass, fiber, and other products. Such trees can produce a marketable product in as few as 10 years. Rapid initial growth requires selecting the right stock, preparing a site, appropriate planting practices, and vegetation management. While different varieties of trees have different needs, right now I'm going to give you the general guidelines for getting a tree crop started. We'll get into the specifics of hybrid poplar and willow later. When you choose your tree stock, you have to take into account the field conditions where you intend to plant. The predominant stock types here are dormant unrooted, dormant rooted cuttings, and container-grown stock or plugs. The best results can be obtained with dormant stock, and due to the risk of drought, dormant rooted stock is preferred. It's more expensive than rooted cuttings, but more reliable. It's the most versatile stock type for the prairies. Most dormant rooted stock is container-grown in greenhouses in the styroblock tray system. Dormant rooted cuttings are called bare root and are grown in an outdoor nursery bed. For starter stock, the nursery uses unrooted dormant cuttings with a top caliper of 1 to 1.5 centimeters or 3 to 5/8 of an inch with a length of 15 centimeters or 6 inches and at least one live bud within about 2.5 centimeters or an inch of the top. The main aim should always be to grow the maximum possible caliper, measured at about 2.5 centimeters or an inch above the top of the starter cutting. Height is not that critical, but growing a large caliper certainly is. A good choice would be to grow the stalk as tall and as fat as possible. Then, just before sorting and packaging, cut the main stem back to about 20 to 30 centimeters or 8 to 12 inches above ground level. The roots can be pruned back to ease storage, handling, and planting. The great advantage of bare root stock is its capacity to grow coarse roots. If you decide to start with unrooted dormant stock, the main type is cuttings. Cuttings used as planting stock in the prairie region have typically been 20 to 30 centimeters or 8 to 12 inches in length. The recommended standard for top caliper is 1 to 2 centimeters or 3/8 to 3/4 of an inch, with at least one live bud within 2.5 centimeters or an inch of the top. Cuttings should be free of branches and show no sign of damage or disease. Once you've selected the appropriate stock for your field conditions, you have to prepare your site. Start by going out to the field to assess the existing vegetation. Determine if you have primarily annuals such as cereals, pulse, or oilseed crops, or perennials such as forage crops. You're likely to have a combination of both annual and perennial weeds. Take steps to control the perennial vegetation by using a post-emergent herbicide. Cultivating will cut any sod and root mass in the soil. Breaking up the heavy soils and compacting the layers with tools that penetrate 15 to 20 centimeters or 6 to 20 inches deep. One pass with the cultivator will leave the ground rough. A second cultivation will break down the rough surface texture. Level and firm the top 5 to 15 centimeters or 2 to 6 inches of the soil, making it easier to control weeds. When the soil is ready, mark out your rows and cross-mark them to ensure adequate spacing between the trees. Spacing affects tree growth and health, maintenance, and the end use of the wood. Dense planting are more prone to disease because of the reduced air circulation and high humidity. Widely spaced trees attain crown closure at a later age, meaning that an additional year or so of weed control may be necessary. But wider spacings also result in faster growth, larger crowns, and heavier branches. There are 3 different ways to mark out your site. You can use a mechanical marker, hire a crew of professional tree planters, or if the job is small enough, do it yourself. For narrow crown clones, use a 3-meter or 10-foot square grid pattern. You'll need some small equipment for this, but it will allow 2-way maintenance. For narrow to medium crown clones, use a grid pattern with 3.6 by 2.4 meter rectangular grid or 12 feet by 8 feet. This is an effective use of your area, but limits maintenance to one direction. For medium to wide crown clones, use a square grid pattern, 3.6 meters or 12 feet. Yields may be slightly less per hectare, but that's offset by the benefits of 2-way maintenance. Once you have your trees marked out, decide whether you'll use your contractors to plant or whether you can manage it yourself. Get the right tools and figure out the right time to plant. Rooted cuttings should be planted in the spring within 3 to 4 weeks of ground thaw and before shoots break on the bud and start new growth. When the distance is less than 3 hours from the nursery, non-refrigerated vehicles can be used either to transport stock directly to the planting site, provided the trees are planted that day, or to cool storage facilities. If pickup trucks are used, the seedlings should be stacked carefully to allow good airflow around the bags or boxes, then covered with a tarp. At the planting site, the stock should be stored in a cool area protected from the sun, wind, and freezing temperatures. Tarps or tents with no floors should be used to cover the seedlings. Trees should not be stored for more than 24 hours in these conditions. Overwintered outside container stock seedlings are usually transported in the containers they were grown in and are kept moist with frequent watering. They should be kept in the shade and planted that day or placed in the cool storage at the site. Planting techniques will vary depending on the type of material being planted and the terrain. Hand planting is probably the most common approach. Hand planting by an experienced crew can be nearly as fast as mechanized planting with fewer mistakes. Once your tree crop is planted, you'll have to practice some sort of vegetation management. We've already discussed cultivating before planting and then leaving space between plants to cultivate regularly while the trees are growing. You can also use herbicide to control unwanted vegetation. Your choice of herbicide depends on site conditions, weed species, soil type, and climate. A third way to manage vegetation is to mulch around the trees with plastic, wood chips, or flax straw. Taking regular steps to manage vegetation is important, right from planting to harvest. I hope this introduction to tree planting has given you some useful background and that you'll delve deeper into planting other varieties such as willow and poplar. Forest companies are looking toward private landowners for an additional wood supply. In the short term, they'll likely be private owners of aspen or poplar stands that will be the greatest beneficiaries. However, for the long term, there's an opportunity for hybrid poplar plantations to be planted on parcels of cleared land. The keys to success are using clones adapted to the area, good planting material, proper planting methods, and good weed control. Moisture and sunlight will also get the trees growing well. Rooted containers have a higher survival rate, provided they have a sufficient caliber or stem size of at least half a centimeter or 3/16 of an inch in diameter. Extended cool, wet spring conditions after planting can cause cuttings to rot. A major factor in their success is the caliber size, and cuttings should have a minimum size of 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch in diameter. One live bud should be within about 2 1.5 centimeters or an inch of the top, and a second bud should be within 7.5 centimeters or 3 inches of the top. Cuttings that have no well-developed buds will grow from the selected branch node or from the cambium at the top of the cutting. Bare root stock can also be used and works very well, but is the most expensive. The shoot on the bare root stock should have a 1/2 to 1 centimeter or 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch caliper at a location about 2.5 centimeters or an inch above the top of the starter cutting. It's important that a proper site is chosen for growing hybrid poplars. They prefer to grow in slightly acidic, loamy soils with a pH of 5.5 to 7.5, rich in nitrogen, in full sunlight, and in slopes less than 8 degrees. They will tolerate sandy to clay loams. They like high moisture areas. They don't like hard pan soils. Bare root and container stock can be planted as soon as the soil temperature reaches 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 inches depth. Cuttings should be planted when the soil temperature reaches 14 degrees Celsius or 57 degrees Fahrenheit at a 4-inch depth. The planting grid should use at least 10-foot squares, which is 436 trees for each acre of land. If saw logs are to be produced, a grid of 12-foot squares is recommended, or 300 trees per acre. Hand planting works well. An experienced planter can plant 300 to 400 trees per hour, depending on the planting conditions. Excellent weed control is a must and can be a challenge. Weeds grow rapidly after planting if moisture and heat are adequate and can easily get out of control. Weed control should ideally start a year before planting, when chemical and non-chemical integrated weed control can be used. Weed control options are limited after planting. Cultivation works, but be careful since deep working can damage roots and damaged roots will sucker. The only herbicide that can be used as oversprays are some registered for grassy and volunteer cereal control. Using registered herbicides in row during the growing season can be done using a direct spray in a hooded sprayer. There are also registered herbicide options when the trees are dormant. Growing trees organically can work on a small scale. In larger plantings, it's difficult and it requires a lot of mowing and cultivation. An option is to use herbicides only in the first 2 or 3 years to get the trees established. Remember, when you're growing hybrid poplars, in the years of planting, the main objective is to get the trees properly rooted. After that, on average, 1 meter or 3 to 4 feet of growth a year can be expected if moisture and sunlight are adequate and weeds are controlled. Growing native willows for biomass production could increase the diversity, profits, and viability of farms across Canada. Willow has a very high biomass production potential. Its energy value is similar to other hardwoods. It's easily established with unrooted cuttings, and it resprouts vigorously after harvest. When choosing stock, caution needs to be taken that the clones selected are able to survive prairie climates. Due to cost, unrooted cuttings are preferable for high-density plantings. They should have a top caliper of 1 to 1 to 2 centimeters or 3/8 to 3/4 of an inch, with a length of 20 to 30 centimeters or 8 to 12 inches. And of course, they should be free of branches and show no signs of damage or disease. The preparation of the site depends on whether you plan to use a mechanical planter. If you do, the rows need to be worked first so that there is good root to shoot contact. And if possible, a pre-emergent herbicide should be laid down. Willow can be planted in high density, and that means spacing is important. Use a grid pattern with a 1.5 meter by 3/4 of a meter rectangular grid, or 5 feet by 2.5 feet. Make sure you take into account what method you will be using for harvesting. Cuttings should be planted with top 1 centimeter of a stick outside of the ground. Even though with such high crop densities, you may need less weed control, vegetation management is important. Mechanical weed control can be used in between the double rows, and chemical weed control can be used between the single rows. In a 2-year crop cycle, good weed control is more important in the first year. Willow crops are natural for Saskatchewan. They increase habitat diversity, they are planted on open agricultural land, not on cleared forest land, and a crop can be harvested 6 to 7 times before replanting is required. Well, that's our tour through the trees.